Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's Kensal and Kilburn Better 2020 event, Schools Interrupted. Now, many of you who've joined us before will know that Kensal and Kilburn was set up in 2017, and we have held many meetings over the last 3 years on the big social and political issues of our day. We've had meetings on climate change, Brexit, we've done events on schools before, housing, and periodically the state of the Labour Party. But tonight we're back to the question of education. And what we're going to do tonight is look at the long-term meaning and impact of the ongoing disruption in schools since March the 16th, when the first lockdown was announced, and when schools, contrary to a lot of commentary that said schools closed, in fact schools split into two functions: providing education for the vulnerable and the children of key workers on the one hand, and providing online learning for the rest of the school population on the other hand. And for 5 months our students were in lockdown with their families and carers, and many of them struggled to, for various reasons, access education during that time, as well as missing out on the peer experience of being at school. So since early September, schools have gone back. The government have become absolutely adamant that keeping open the economy and keeping open schools is what they plan to do. But how successfully that's going, I heard a figure this week that only 78% of students, I think it's secondary students, are currently in school because inadequate test and tracking and tracing systems, and all sorts of schools needing to send home whole year groups and so on. We're seeing a lot of students actually still having their education disrupted, whatever the government's rhetoric. And despite this, the government has announced this week, and again, this is another thing that they're holding on to, that exams will go ahead next year pretty much as they would do normally, even though we are not in normal times. And they've allowed a 3-week delay in exams, which I think we'll probably hear tonight is not adequate. They haven't yet announced what other provisions they're going to bring in to safeguard students who may be been out of school for 5 months in the last academic year, and may be out of school for significant time in this academic year. So that's what we're here to discuss. We're here to look at our school system that is more disrupted than it has been since the Second World War, actually. And we're looking at what's the long-term implications for educational quality, in particular the sort of mass shift to online learning, and what are the long-term implications for educational equality or inequality, and what about the mental health implications for everyone: students, head teachers, teachers, ancillary staff, parents. You know, this is a huge moment, a huge extended moment of crisis. And today, of course, we've heard that London has moved, where we all are, although not everyone on the call Zoom event will, London has moved into the high risk tier, and we're all still working out quite what that means. So just to say something about myself briefly, I'm Melissa Ben, I'm your chair for tonight. I'm a long-time campaigner for comprehensive education. I'm a passionate supporter of state education. I set up the Local Schools Network. I've been a chair of Comprehensive Future, and I've written 3 books arguing for radical, but of course reasonable, reform of the UK state education system. So on to our speakers for tonight. We've got 4 brilliant speakers. The way we're going to organise it is that, just to say, we've got a head teacher here, we have a 6th former to speak, a psychiatrist, and an expert in digital learning. I'm going to ask each of them to speak for about 5 minutes, 6 maximum, and then we'll open it up to questions. As you know, we like to end these events pretty, 8 o'clock on the dot, because we've all got lives and some of us are already quite hungry. And if you've got questions, please put your questions in the Q&A box, which is pretty self-explanatory, and our team will be sorting them and passing them on to me. So on to our first speaker. If I can just say that it happens that 3 of our speakers have some connection to Kensal and Kilburn's local school community, and particularly to Queen's Park Community School. In fact, what they're going to say is of relevance to everyone, and they're not going to just be talking about local situation, it will be relevant to the national situation, but it seems fitting that we have that particular connection to our local school that we're all very devoted to. So our first speaker is Judith Enright, who is the head of QPCS. I was trying to remember how long you've been the head of QPCS for, Judith.
I'm in my 5th year now as head.
You're in your 5th year and still smiling, very impressive, and given the current situation. So Judith is a head teacher, which is a full-time job in itself, but also has a particular interest in education policy and holds an MSc in, let me get this right, Research for Public Policy and Practice from London University, UCL. So Judith, over to you. Tell us, what's it like? What's it been like? What are the implications, and anything positive that might come out of this crisis?
Thank you so much, Melissa. I think what you had wanted me to try and get across to the audience tonight is what's it like? What is a day in the life of another head teacher in another school? And Queen's Park Community School is an inclusive London comprehensive school. We've got about 1,300 students, and we have about 150 staff. So that's a big population of people. And on policy, the government became very clear over the summer. Everybody realised that lockdown with children learning from home was having a terrible impact on mental health and well-being. I think the sort of the noise, the sound and fury coming out of the government and Rishi was all about the economic impact and parents unable to go into work with their children at home. But really, for those of us working in education, and I'm also a parent, I've got 3 teenage children myself, the biggest concern for us was about their well-being. And that with the best will in the world, with the best technology in the world, with the best Wi-Fi, there are huge limitations to children being able to continue their education during any sort of lockdown. So saying that, we worked incredibly hard as a team, a whole team of staff, to welcome back everybody. And Lola's one of our senior student leaders, so you'll hear a bit more from her about what it's been like from the student side. And the implications, though, are very stressful. Melissa has written a piece today, having spoken to a range of head teachers. And I think it is falling particularly on head teachers at the moment, because we're being given very unusual powers for fundamentally teachers. For example, we seem to suddenly have become epidemiologists. We seem to have become experts in health and safety in the workplace, virology, and a whole range of fields which weren't necessarily things for which we had immense training prior to 2020. And so there is a lot of learning on the job. To give an example, my day began with trying to get through to Public Health England. We have one student, a terrible situation that, having had COVID, this student, then it's gone through their family. And so this student has been out of school since the 18th of September because they happen to be the first in their family to have COVID. And now weeks later, both parents and now a sibling just yesterday testing positive. So 45 minutes, it's on hold. It makes a strange boing noise while you're on hold. Don't quite know why. They used to have some nice music, that seems to have gone. So that's boinging quietly in the background. And meanwhile, I'm giving feedback to a teacher, which in itself is quite a challenge. So I've been observing lessons. I'm having to stay 2 meters away. In QPCS, everyone is wearing a face mask. There were some cases 2 weeks after we came back, unsurprisingly, after all our meals out and holidays. 2 weeks after we came back, we had several cases, and now we've moved pretty smoothly, thanks to a donation of face masks from a local business person. 4,000 face masks, I have to say, is what it's taken to have all students and all staff wearing face masks throughout the day, apart from when they're eating their lunch. So, you know, there are all the students in their face masks, there am I in my face mask, and I'm observing the lesson. And then following the lesson, the sort of post-observation feedback takes in both what the students are doing right now, it takes in what they did during lockdown, it looks at the remote learning. We're using Google Classroom. We'd already done quite a bit of work to set that up, but what we were setting it up for was never what we were then anticipating using it for. And it is the whole thing, you know, our whole education system is set up for face-to-face learning, face-to-face teaching. And we've now got a situation where we've got some students in different classes having to isolate for 2 weeks because of someone in their household or contact from test and trace. We've got sometimes, and certainly we had when there were several cases at once, 2 weeks after the start of term, maybe a whole class having to be at home or several classes. So we've got the teachers perfectly fine and healthy and able to teach in school, but trying to teach remotely to a class who are stuck at home. And then also we have got this situation of maybe a member of staff who, again, within their own household, somebody is ill, and so they're stuck at home, they're perfectly well, but for 2 weeks, they're going to be having to teach all their students in school from home. So there's quite a lot of logistical challenges there. And it's now become part of the lesson observation and feedback process. And, you know, the work goes on and on and on that, because pedagogically, I mean, I've been working with online education since 1997 in London schools, and you know, the technology cannot drive the pedagogy. It has to be about the teacher's practice and then using the tools, and we have a wealth of tools, a huge variety of things available to us, but it's using those to the best effect to help children learn. So that is a very interesting, you know, intellectually interesting exercise, but the harsh reality of that, as Melissa said in her introduction, is we have got Lola's year group, year 13, we have got our year 11s faced with really high stakes exams, which have been moved back by 3 generous weeks. So that is quite extraordinarily decisive action from the government to move that back 3 weeks. And meanwhile, there's now a 6-week consultation, including information about mocks. Now, I was with the deputy head, this is part of my day in the life of today, planning for mock examinations and how they can be conducted as safely as possible. But even then we can make plans, and we have to, you know, I have a son in year 13 as well. For our young people, certainty is really, really important at the moment. There are so many things that are uncertain. And for the government to leave it that long, and dither is the only possible word I can describe this as being, is just unacceptable. And they have had a lot of time. We were already making plans in late February as to how we could safely have conducted 2020 exams. Germany went ahead with the Abitur. You know, other countries are doing different things, but for some reason our country seems to be uniquely incompetent in every aspect of policy around COVID. And the upsetting thing as a parent and as a school leader is the impact of their poor decision-making and their late decision-making and their dithering and their U-turns, is that there are thousands and thousands, there are hundreds of thousands of young people very, very upset about this at a time when we're all feeling quite upset already. So, yeah, you know, this has been a very sort of difficult thing. And, you know, my sort of headline really is about well-being. It's about our staff and students and how we can support them through this. Any positives? Am I running out of time,
yeah,
Melissa?
You are running out of time, so maybe we'll come back to that, because I know it's hugely unfair to ask a head in your position to speak for 6 minutes about your situation, but I like that we're going to stop at the government's failings. That suits my particular shade. So I will come back, and I think there will be questions about the long term and positives, but just because I want to give everyone a chance to speak, and if you could think in your speaking of maybe 5 minutes if you can, just so that we can get a chance for that exchange. So our next speaker is Lola Jempeji, who is in year 13 at Queen's Park Community School. You're doing A-levels in history, sociology and psychology, and Lola, you're a senior student leader. So perhaps following on from your head teacher, maybe not an easy thing to do, tell us how it's been and your thoughts on this crisis.
So right from the beginning, so when we first started the lockdown, it has been quite difficult. in my own experience. I think the transition between going from being taught physically by teachers and having that interaction with teachers to then being taught online, where there is a lack of interaction, it has affected a lot of students in terms of being able to remember information. I think as I'm a very interactive learner, I prefer to have that interaction with the teacher, have the teacher at the front talking, and it has affected my retention. I think speaking with some students at school, some of my fellow students, it's generally agreed among us that studying online is very, very different. The lack of being able to just have the teacher at the front of the class teaching, talking, it definitely is going to have a big impact on our exams. I think the fact that depending on different situations, everybody's circumstances are very different. Some people might not have access to Wi-Fi, for example. That will also really affect our performance in the exams. There is a lot of uncertainties with this pandemic. There has been so many detrimental and negative effects on mental health, on what is going to be our performance in their exams. And I think it is agreed among us at school that generally having 3 weeks to replace 5 months, 6 months of learning online is not the best decision that the government could have made. Even now, we have different situations around the country where certain students have to self-isolate because of family members, because of interaction with other students, and that is we're definitely going to see the effects of that in exams. So I think it is really unrealistic to replace 5 months of missed learning with 3 weeks extra. I think it's very unrealistic. In terms of being in the lockdown, not being able to interact, to socialize with people, that has had a negative effect on the mental health of a lot of students. I think the mental health of a lot of year 13s, of a lot of year 11s, not to say the younger students, has really plummeted over the past 6 months. We've seen this of the pandemic, like it's been a very sad situation. And then also having to worry about having to worry about our exams, which is going to have a massive impact on our future. Altogether, it's not been the best situation at all.
Right, that's very clear. And I almost, you did say when we talked before that there was one positive. Could you just quickly tell me the one positive that you found, because it's important, just in a sentence?
So I said that the one positive that I could think of is knowing that our teachers are readily able to sort of show that they're there for us, to know that we have their support. I said that is the one positive thing that came out of this pandemic.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks. That's great. Thank you so much, Lola. That was great. So now, sort of continuing that theme in a way, but from a different angle, is our next speaker, Mark Nathan, who is a consultant child psychiatrist at Enfield Child Adolescent Mental Health Services, particularly specialising in working with adolescents and children in care. And Mark, you also have 2 daughters in secondary school, so this will have a very particular resonance.
That's right, Melissa.
Yeah.
Thank you. So yeah, I work for CAMS, which is Child and Adolescent Mental Health Service. And that's part of the NHS, and we work closely with schools and with social services and pediatrics. And the CAMS view going into the lockdown was that we were going to have a lot of mental health problems in our kids. So we were very worried about that. And especially at the beginning, it didn't quite go like that. First thing is we had a real decrease in the number of referrals to CAMS. And then the second thing is we found that quite a few of our families, at least initially, took very well to the school closure. I think some of the kids who come to CAMS are struggling with school anyway. And many of the families at the beginning took it as a bit of an opportunity to relax, be together, find things to do, there was, there was a novelty in that many people enjoyed. And as the lockdown continued, that's when we saw the kind of variability set in. And while some carried on having good lockdowns, more and more families were starting to run into trouble. So, for example, I had a young Eritrean woman, 17 years old, who just arrived in the country, and she was straight into the lockdown, completely isolated, very lonely, not able to go to college, not able to find her feet at all. Or I had a teenage boy who got completely stuck in a computer games routine to the point where he just couldn't stop. And ordinarily he would have stopped to go to school. But in the lockdown situation, it got very extreme. More generally, we did start to see quite a few kids who were very anxious and fearful, and also who were restricting themselves more than they had to. They weren't actually following the guidelines because they were going so far beyond what the guidelines actually said, not going out hardly at all. And connected with that, we were seeing a lot of parents who were anxious. It wasn't uncommon to get parents who, were worried about the contagion aspects, or who were worried about dying. And of course, the way that adults kind of get through these kind of situations has a big effect on the kids. And there were lots of stressful issues for parents. Initially, there was the issue of food supplies and the supermarkets, but then there were health worries and financial issues, worries about relatives. And then there was all the learning how to work from home, how to create a new family routine. And, as Judith has kind of mentioned, there was this particular worry for parents about how do they suddenly become home tutors, or how did they get in charge of their kids' learning. And that was, right across the board, not only at CAMS, but everywhere. That was a real challenge for parents. It was very stressful. And some parents who almost tried too hard and got locked into big battles with their kids. And sometimes we found that the parents who kind of didn't sweat the homework very much actually had the best lockdowns, because they were able to kind of cruise through things and keep the peace. The kids themselves often complained that the lockdown was boring, or that they missed their friends, or that they felt lonely, or frustrated, or that they were worried about people falling sick. And with all of those, the thing to do is to, normalize the worries. Those are, those things are all right. It is boring. It is frustrating. We'll get through it, but it's going to be tough. And in some ways, we were more worried about kids who just totally accepted the lockdown without any frustration, because, it's a difficult situation. And kids did succumb to the loss of routine and the lack of exercise and the reduction in social contact, too much computer use, etc., etc. Returning to school. Now, we thought that was going to be difficult for a lot of kids. And I don't know what Judith found with that, but our experience was that actually kids may have been a bit anxious about going back, but by and large, they wanted to go back. And when they did go back, they were happy to be back. The other thing that people have talked about is this big surge of referrals to mental health services. They were discussing that on the radio last night, but we in our service haven't seen that yet. We've kind of returned to our normal kind of situation. I did want to highlight that school closure is particularly worrying for kids who are living in abusive environments. And that's for two reasons, because the kind of situations that go with child abuse, like parents using alcohol and domestic violence, or parental mental illness, are all exacerbated by a lockdown situation. And the second thing is that child protection services really rely on schools for their referrals. So if the schools aren't picking up these cases, they're going to be left at home. The schools aren't the only ones, but they're a major source of referrals. And that feeds kind of into the general point that kids who are in unhappy homes are going to have a worse lockdown, where their parents are fighting, or where they're fighting with siblings, or where things just aren't happy. And the even more general point from that is that schools are obviously not just about academic learning. I think Lola, you kind of alluded to this when you talked about the kind of social lives falling off and people kind of feeling disconnected from each other. You know, for kids, schools are a safe haven, but also a place to make friends, to be part of a group and to get away from their parents for a while and to kind of make friends with other adults who aren't their parents, to get a structure to their day, all those kind of things. And, you know, in the case of future closures, we're worried that they're going to lose all of that. All of that will kind of be jeopardized. And that's the worry about if these disruptions go on from our point of view. And I think especially with the kind of falling off of public trust and the maybe less community spirit than there was at the beginning, I think at CAMHS we're feeling, well, we got through the first lockdown okay, but the second one may not be so easy at all. The novelty is worn off. The kind of hope that we're going to be returning to normality has died down. You know, it may really, you know, we're going to be up against it with the next one. And so I guess we are anticipating a kind of increase in mental health problems in kids and in parents as well. People kind of reaching the end of their resources and kind of moods dropping and so on. I don't know how I'm doing for time, Melissa.
I think you're unfortunately on your time. So have you?
No, that's fine. That's a good place for me to.
I think your last point is so important because there's a kind of weariness and it's winter. And I think a lot of people have said that when the first lockdown happened, that incredible sunshine, I mean, I don't know if it was everywhere, but it was just a different feel now. So now we're coming to our last speaker, who is a member of our own team, Kensal and Kilburn Better 2020. So Stephen Haggard, though we call him Steve. And so Steve is an expert in online learning, having once run the Open University's course production business, and his company Digital Learning Associates now makes online materials used in schools and universities all over the world. And Steve, you're going to talk to us about this huge shift onto screens with education, good or bad?
Okay, yes, so the world was moving slowly towards screen-based education, you know, before this happened. As happens in many crisis situations, the underlying trend has been accelerated, and there's no doubt that we're going to be seeing a lot more of home-based learning, video lessons, interactive kind of learning, anything behind a screen. That is going to be ramping up a lot. And I think the interesting point is it's probably permanent. I don't think there's going to be a, you know, let's say we get out of this as Fauci in the US says within 12 months. I don't see it going back to exactly the way it was in terms of the ratio of screen-based to in-person learning. The question I think for all of us is, what does that mean? Is that something that we can see any good sides in, or is that all bad news? I mean, I think the move to online is ambivalent. For some people, it's rather good, and you do hear many teachers commenting that the student who was, you know, quiet and sat in the back and didn't contribute when it was an in-person class, and they might have felt a bit intimidated, very often is actually empowered by the online format to come forward and make contributions. There's you know, no role for sort of blustering and aggression in online. You just have to do the work, and there are some good sides to that. But I think that for many students, it's a much worse outcome. Maybe they haven't got access to the technology or the bandwidth, or the sort of social and psychological support that allows you to focus on your tasks in a situation without a teacher to guide you just isn't there for them. And there's no doubt that one of the effects of the increasing role of online is increasing inequality in education outcomes. And that's a pity, and that's something we're all going to have to think very hard about. I mean, we're going to have to, I think, also start understanding more, and this applies to teachers and parents and students. What is it that makes an online learning experience a good learning experience? You know, all learning can be good and bad, and teachers can be bad as well as good. We need to understand what is it that makes these screen-based experiences effective and enjoyable and engaging for students. And I think we're only just beginning as education communities to talk about that in a really sophisticated way now. And that's partly the, you know, the online product have been getting more sophisticated. So we've moved away from a sense of, okay, well, I can just put a camera in front of the teacher, that'll be a lesson. It's not, it doesn't work. The students are disengaged. It's not the same feeling as being in a class. So you can't just try to imitate what a classroom looks like with a camera and send it out on Zoom. That's not going to teach anybody. It's not going to keep the kids engaged. You can't just make them do lots of online worksheets that are just sort of filling in boxes and gap fill and things like that. Again, it sends students down very unequal pathways, because only those who've got a lot of support to continue that kind of activity will make any progress. So one of the things I think we might, if we're lucky, see a lot of is a format of online learning, which they called either blended or flipped learning, which is where the students might be learning in both a classroom and an online situation. Typically, they'll use the online activity to get across the content, try and understand the basic issue, make sure they've all understood it. That can be checked with a few simple tests, but then they'll come into an all-together situation with the teacher. One hopes it would be in person, it might have to be online, where they can discuss and exchange opinions, and you can exercise all those skills around communication and collaboration and projects and so forth that are what kids really get so much out of their school for. I think it's always worth remembering that the school is partly about content, but it's also about learning to cope with all those difficult but important things. How do you share an opinion, disagree, bring forward some evidence, all that kind of stuff that needs to be at the center of education. And in some online models, the flipped online model, where you effectively flip the classroom round and you make the experience of the class one of discussion rather than one of learning content, that can actually be a really good form of education. So, that's something that we could look out for and hope that actually most children will be able to do very well under those kind of approaches. I think there's also possibly an opportunity here. I mean, schools have been pushed for a long time by the government to focus on just, cramming kids' heads with facts and then testing those in standardized tests and calling that an assessment. And yeah, okay, it assesses something, but what we really want our schools to be doing for our students is something much more complex. And what this crisis has revealed, I think, is that that is actually really what the schools were good for. What we really got out of our schools was that students encountered the reality of life in a sort of safe space and learnt to negotiate it. And I'm hopeful that, now that we've realized that, we can start breaking education down into what is the bit of education that's about giving kids content and knowledge, and what is the bit of it that's about supporting them to become, full members of our communities and grow up as citizens. And the first bit of it, giving them knowledge, actually, online is okay at that. It's also nice to have a teacher, as Lola said. It's important to have that person there, and you can, engage with them for checking your facts or whatever it is. But you can also do that online, and that may be okay. And for people like those in the year that's had to go into lockdown, or the student who's temporarily had to work at home, there's really nothing to be frightened of about those formats. They can be good, but we just have to make sure, I think, that the schools can continue to focus on what they do brilliantly about educating and bringing up a next generation in a social way, alongside their traditional role of giving them content, which I think we'll now see moving much, much more into the online space. So mixed picture. The big problem I have with all of this is that the learning industry, unfortunately, has a model that's based on surveillance, quite high charges very often to schools, takes money out of schools' budgets, quite standardized testing. And we just have to make sure that we're getting learning online for our young people that really sees them doing creative things, engaging with each other, and not just sort of passively consuming content.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you. It's quite interesting to hear how positive you are, actually, because I have to say myself, I have very mixed feelings about moving to online learning. And just to say it, I feel that I'm not sure that knowledge through a screen can be quite the same as knowledge learnt in a classroom with interaction and teachers. But then I'm not an expert. That's just from my own experience. It's always been humans that have inspired me and coaxed things out of me, and I've seen that also with my my daughters, but I'll let others comment.
I agree with you. I agree
Yeah.
with you, but it's not necessarily the case that you can't get that through online. Online done well can deliver a lot of that. And if we have to go online, then at least let's make sure that what we do online does do that as well as it can.
Okay, fine. Well, since the questions are mounting up, so I think I'm just going to go straight to the first one, which is from Di Beddoe. And it's a question for you, Judith. I think you're going to get a few questions here. It said you were observing lessons. So perhaps if you could answer quite briefly, but it said, is Judith obliged to observe lessons in such a traumatic period for schools and staff? I think it's a genuine question. Are you obliged to? And presumably that's just to check on health and safety procedures and offer support. So a quick answer to that?
Yeah, well, I'm not obliged to do anything in a sense. I'm the head teacher. It's a conscious decision. It's some of our very best teachers. They're applying to go through the threshold, and it's really about, it's a supportive and fact-finding thing, exactly the kind of thing that Stephen was talking about. What is their best practice online? How does that fit in with face-to-face? So there's no point bringing all the children back in if the quality of education when they're back in is poor. So it's an important part of the process, but it's not, it's quite the opposite of traumatic. It's reassuring normality and what really matters, rather than being on the phone with Public Health England all day.
Yeah, no, who on earth would want to do that? And particularly as it doesn't seem to be existing anymore. It's been sort of abolished halfway through. Now, just a question here about teachers' mental health. Nobody said much about teachers' mental health. I don't know, Mark, I know you don't see teachers, but whether you have a feeling about that. Is that something that's been neglected? And I'm sure, Judith, you've got something to say on that. Quick reply.
Yeah, well, I guess teachers are probably quite like CAMHS workers in a way. They've probably felt very much on the front line, carried on going to work, kind of huge expectations of them, very worried about how it's going to go, having to continually kind of improvise and create new routines, invent things, and also being heavily scrutinized and the focus of so much attention. I imagine it's kind of pretty tough.
Right. Okay, Judith, do you agree with that? Do you just, maybe it's obvious, it is very tough.
Yes, and I think Mark alluded to this, that actually the first few weeks, everyone's back, there's that utter relief. And in some ways, we are truly privileged. Talking to a colleague who runs a charity, and her workers in their 20s are still cooped up in their little inadequate accommodation trying to work online. We've got a massive, great, gorgeous school site. So, we're in a really privileged position. But as Mark says, carrying then the weight of all the mental health issues that Lola has spoken about, that we've all sort of raised, and supporting everybody other than themselves. So yeah, we've had very good support from Brent, the Education Psychology Service, and Brent Centre for Young People, for really sort of specific support for teachers. The thing teachers are finding hardest is we don't get together in the way that we're used to doing. We can't sit and have lunch together. We can't, all those little sort of things, all those the staff social at the start of term. So teachers are finding that hard, and we're doing what we can to make sure that teachers don't feel isolated, that they can connect while staying 2 meters apart.
I work quite a lot with teachers, and in the settings I've been working with teachers, we've seen that the frustration of this thing of trained and experienced in a face-to-face live discipline, where you can use your full spontaneous interaction with your students, the frustration of having to sort of quickly turn around and become a technical operator and use these quite restrictive approaches that come with screen-based learning is really frustrating and agonizing, I think, for a lot of teachers. They feel that the thing they came into the profession for isn't accessible to them again. And I hear a lot of frustration about that, and stress as well.
Yeah, I just wondered, Lola, do you, it's maybe a bit unfair to ask you to observe something on teachers' mental health, but you must be marking the difference between, as it were, normal times before the pandemic and now. Any thoughts on that?
I think because it's such an uncertain and a very difficult situation, I think the teachers are trying to handle it the best that they can, especially at my school. But I think you can definitely see the difference in how they coped before the pandemic and now, because they have a lot more to juggle with. Like, they have students who feel sick and need to leave urgently. They have students, like we have students who are applying for Oxbridge, which we've now sent off, thankfully, but teachers have had a lot to juggle with. So I think, yeah, it's very understandable that people are worrying about teachers' mental health. I think it is really important.
Yeah. And as I mentioned before, I've just this week been doing talking to head teachers, and well, I mean, that seems an unbelievably stressful situation, to be responsible for the whole thing and have to send home a whole year group, and to make, I mean, I you know, I don't want to sort of worry you, but you know, if you feel you're getting ill yourself, presumably you feel that the whole structure depends on you being well. And so really, this is just me not offering you a question, because what can you say? But yes, it is really hard, but I'm coping. But I mean, you know, my heart goes out to you, actually.
But it is, in a school, it's always a team approach. So, you know, and I think that when you reflect on it, the weight of responsibility on a head teacher at any time is already enormous. And yeah, this just throws in some additional pressures. But that team, the teamwork and the support of the governors is very important, and I think that's what is helping head teachers through.
Okay, now we've got a quite straightforward question here, which sort of touches on what you've all brought up in terms of the government's decision to just go ahead but delay for 3 weeks. Natalie Raffray, should GCSE and A-levels be cancelled next year, or is a delay the best solution to an unknown situation? Now, who wants to go on that one first? I let Lola. What do you think? Should they be cancelled next year?
My personal opinion is that they should. I think we are at more of a disadvantage than the year 13s who just went to uni were, because at the beginning of the lockdown, I think that the year 13s, they could have done their exams at that point, but we have missed 5 to 6 months of learning, which has now been replaced by an additional 3 weeks. And I don't think it's fair, because we also don't know if another lockdown is coming, which it seems like it is likely, which means we might even miss more interactive with school. So I think that the exams should be cancelled.
Yeah. And what would you like to see in their place? To have a sort of teacher assessment, and as long as that's fairly moderated?
Yeah, I think the whole issue with the centre assessed grades and having everybody marked down, the year 13s, and that whole really bad affair, I do think that we should, it's kind of difficult because people won't perform as well as they should right now. So if everything is based off of what we're doing now, that's also kind of unfair. So I'm not sure.
So you feel it's just with going ahead with exams, you're doubly disadvantaged because you're into your second year of disruption, really. And that seems unarguable, isn't it, Judith? That, I mean, are you allowed to express an opinion? I'm not quite sure how much you have to be.
I have to express an opinion.
Yes. Okay. Express your opinion.
I blogged on this. And actually, Lola's given me a really good insight there to something that I hadn't really thought about. But in my view, I think I'm sorry, Lola, but I think for A-levels, exams have to go ahead, because there is just such an element of uncertainty and disparity between what a teacher thinks a student will get in an exam and what they actually go on to get in an exam. So, but actually with Lola speaking there, what I feel we should do, the government used this phrase triple lock in the summer, absolute nonsense, confused everybody and made no sense. But actually, maybe there is a way through this that teachers can say, look, this student really was, an A grade student. They were on track for this, but now have missed those months in lockdown, a sort of certified statement that this young person had little access to Wi-Fi, was unable to engage with everything that was going on online, etc. So, and maybe it's done by postcode, maybe that, but that there is some sort of special consideration given, which is proper special. They have a system of special consideration, for example, if a student is unwell and misses a lot of schooling, but it's very minimal. It does not remotely give students the credit that they should get for that. So that they've got to given that they are determined that exams will go ahead, they've got to allow for proper special consideration. GCSEs, I think some GCSEs should probably go ahead, English and maths, science, and sort of benchmarking GCSEs. But for all the reasons Lola's outlined, you know, I really don't think that it's appropriate for all the other GCSEs to go ahead. And logistically, it's going to be very hard. If we want our year 13s to take these all important exams, there is a risk then of COVID spreading because year 11s are around them as well. You know, you've got to sort of protect what is most important in my view.
Yeah, it's worth pointing out that Scotland has decided to replace their equivalent of GCSEs with teacher assessment or centre CA, you know, centre assessed grades, but they are going ahead with their hires, which is the A level equivalent.
And GCSEs, teachers are much better at saying that this is what this student is going to get. You know, it's the mock to the GCSE, it's a pretty reliable path. A levels is more erratic just because they're studying so much in so much depth over such a short period of time, and you know, they either pull it all together at the last minute or they don't.
Yeah, I mean, just a point that I'd like to make here is what I really worry about exams going ahead is that the gap between, let's say, the affluent, privately educated young person who is going to have always had everything online, going to have had teachers giving them, I mean, I think the figure was up to 5 hours a day of online learning from last March. And that, and in a way, taking up Mark's point that for some families, particularly affluent families, being at home was a sort of way to recharge, but you were also keeping up with your work. And then comparing that with students who may have disappeared from our state school system completely because of family problems. And there's no way that they're going to be able to sort of do their exams in a basic sense. And you know, a lot of people say the government are not very in touch with large parts of the state school system. They tend to have, yes, I can see your face, Judith, and I can see that you're responding in a way that says you agree, and that the government tends to have its certain key head teachers in the state system that it listens to, and they're often the head of quite successful schools, and it's quite sort of close with the private school establishment. So that really worries me. That inequality growing worries me. Does anybody want to take me on and say, no, I shouldn't be worried about it? I'm not take me on, but anybody got a comment on that before we move to the next question? Does that seem fair, that concern of mine?
Yeah, and I'd underline that one of the effects of the move to online learning is that it increases the speed and the width of that inequality. So from that perspective, you know, online learning makes everything more problematic rather than solving anything. Okay,
well, the questions are piling up now. There's one for you, Lola. So what advice would you give to year 7 children just starting at secondary school and getting to know each other who may suddenly find themselves at home because of COVID, having to learn online? How should they structure their time? Well, that's asking you to do a bit of a professional job, but give whatever advice you want to, you know.
I understand for the year 7s because they kind of, it's a weird transition between year 6 and year 7 and everything is new to them. So I understand that being stuck at home is going to be really difficult for a lot of them. I think my advice would be to try and get, as hard as it is to do everything online, try and get as stuck in with their work as they can. I know teachers won't make it difficult for them, they'll try and make it as fun and interactive as they can. So I would say try and get as much from it as you can in a way. Yeah, try and get involved, get stuck in with whatever your school has to offer. It's a bit difficult to do anything, like you can't really socialize, you can't make friends, it's harder to do all of that online. So
you know, it just occurred to me that maybe QPCS was always brilliant at this, having older years mentoring younger years, and that maybe if this carries on, you ought to have a sort of a mentor, an older student who mentors you if you are stuck at home. It's just an idea. Just a couple of, thumbs up from the head teacher there, and I think Mark's looking reasonably positive. We like to get a consensus. Now, a couple of people have mentioned, and Lois Aitkenhead, hello Lois, has asked a really good question. I'm struck at the absence of any mention of creative activity, music, theatre, art and dance. Do you see these things being addressed? So actually, Mark, let me ask you this. How important do you think that is for mental health? And can you observe in any way at how I presume there was quite an absence of that in the first lockdown. What's your thoughts about that before I come to the more obvious educators to answer?
Well, I think it is very important for mental health. It's often a way that people kind of channel emotions and organize their feelings. It's a way of kind of dealing with difficult feelings. We see a lot of kids writing poetry and doing artwork. I think it's very closely linked with emotional well-being and mental health. You know, and maybe it's some of the harder stuff to do online. I'm not sure.
Well, maybe I could take that across then to Steve, and just Steve briefly, is it harder to do that online, or Judith, do you think it is? Steve first, then Judith.
Definitely, yeah, there's no doubt. There's nothing that online can really offer that begins to do that channeling and the self-expression and collective working with your physical identity. It's a lack there. You can watch things passively, and you can do some creative things. People started doing music performance and so forth a little bit online, so you can make some attempts. But I think it's exactly what you said, Mark. Those sort of very powerful expressive experiences that are shared between groups of people are really important, and they're just not there.
Yeah, and somebody's Dara Noble has said here, our school at the start of lockdown furloughed the music, drama and art teacher. Shocking. Doesn't name the school, but that is quite shocking. Now we've just got to keep an eye on time. Somebody has asked a question which I think is quite interesting, given that experience always shapes one's policies and practice. They said, have any of your families had COVID? And if they have, how has it changed your view of all of this? Anybody want to offer a thought there? No? Everybody been COVID free?
In my family, we've all had it.
You've all had it?
Mm-hmm.
And has it affected how you're thinking about things? This is what the questioner wants to ask.
Well, we were lucky enough to none of us have any complications or underlying conditions or anything that made it serious. It was lighter than most flus or colds. But it does make you realize that, it's a very serious threat. You don't have to do much to be in the way of harm. So I suppose from our point of view, it just made us realize that precautions really do matter. And, since then we've all been very careful about wearing masks in public, even though we can't, it's not a risk to us anymore, but, it's just part of.
Oh, you've frozen. So Steve, you've frozen, so I'm going to have to leave you. So that's a pity. One person, just a quick question. I don't know if this is to you, Judith. The lunchtimes are proving stressful with entire year groups corralled together, less chance to bond in small groups. Any chance of providing social clubs or breakout groups on schools or online? Can you give me a brief answer to that?
Yes, and it links to the creativity point too. So creatively, the full creative curriculum continues. No teachers have been furloughed at QPCS. So I don't know.
It wasn't. They weren't talking about QPCS, that questioner. Yeah.
Anyway, but just to make it clear, teachers couldn't be furloughed. It was like a national thing because they all had their pay. Now, clubs, yes. We are doing clubs. We're already doing a lot of PE clubs, for example. So there's a lot, you can risk assess anything. We've got music lessons happening. We'll have all the ensemble groups and everything starting up again. It's just taken us a bit longer this year because there's been so many different things to get going on. So yes, there will be more clubs for all year groups for a range of things. But the key point about the outside aspect is, the breathing the same air as someone might be at risk of spreading the virus. And our priority of this first half term is about everyone doing the full curriculum, but it does mean they're all doing drama and they're all doing music and they're all doing DT, and all of that is carrying on. And there's an immense amount of creativity through the curriculum. Right.
Okay, now look, I want to move to the close, and I thought I'd just read a comment from Helen Civil here, which is, we really felt our 4 children went backwards in their learning and socially during lockdown. They missed their friends, desperate to go outdoors and run. More than that, we struggled with homeschooling. That's quite a big thing, isn't it? Parents, and particularly from all the figures that I've read, women, often mothers, have been taking on homeschooling, and that's had a knock-on effect on their employment and just their time and their mental health. And Helen says the difficulty of being stuck in a small house with 6 of us. What advice do you have for parents about checking your kids are not falling too far behind? in the extent it could jeopardize their return to the education system. I think that's quite a big question to ask, and I don't know if there's a brief answer to it, but she does say, thank goodness for online games and for CBBC. So that's a positive about online things. But I mean, in general, it's very hard, isn't it, for parents to be sort of doing the job of teachers, isn't it? I don't know. Lola, did your parents help you in any way when you were
I had quite a bit to do. I had a lot of work to do, but I can say that my dad did help my little brother a lot with his work online because he was in year 7 at the time. So yeah, definitely. I think I understand though that it is hard for parents because it's not something that they've had to do before. That, like, yes, parents do help with home learning, but having to sort of teach and be the one to take on the teaching role is very different. So
yeah, I have noticed that their figures show that a lot of parents are moving to homeschooling now, and that's not because they loved it, but maybe some discovered they did love it, but that some are nervous about this school's interrupted aspect of this year. Schools are back, but are they? And so there's quite an increase in home learning. Judith, a quick point on that before I ask you all a final question about parents and how they can help their children.
I think the biggest concern we had was about the daily routine. So sleep, bedtime, getting up when your child would be starting their day and sort of following their timetable. And that is the biggest thing you can do. And I know Mark will agree with me because your sleep cycle is absolutely essential for your mental health.
Yeah, that's really important. So look, we're coming to a close. I don't want to end on a falsely positive note, but I would like to put in this thought that Mark brought up in his interesting talk, that we've realised, everybody's alluded to it, schools are so much more than just places where standards are upheld and content is conveyed. They've been shown to be such important parts of the community. And I'd just like each of you to say briefly how you think we'll see education in the future as a result of this crisis. Do you think, you know, it will strengthen the role of heads and teachers and strengthen our belief in schools, or will it weaken our system? So why don't we start from reverse order, and Steve, perhaps you answer that. Everybody do a quick answer to that rather big question.
I think that we're going to see schools remain an absolute pillar of society and of our lives and of young people's lives. I think that the experience for young people of having seen the centerpiece, the underpinning of their whole, yearly and weekly and daily routine just go, for 5 months is probably deeply traumatic. I hope that we'll all come out of it saying, my God, that institution was incredibly important. We must cherish it and build it in the future. And that whatever happens about changing the way that we learn, we'll stay with that. That would be an optimistic hope. Good,
great. Mark, your thoughts on that?
No, I agree with that very much. Yeah, I mean, we've really realized how important schools are to us, and not just for kids, but for grown-ups. It's what kind of binds us all together, really. So I think we've got to come out of this sort of fighting to uphold that and come out of it in good shape.
Yeah. Lola?
I also agree. I think that this pandemic will teach people to appreciate institutions like school a bit more than before, because I think people kind of took that whole routine of going to school, learning, coming back home for granted. So I think this pandemic has really opened a lot of people's eyes. Yeah.
Do you think it's interesting? You started out, we were all talking about the NHS and it looked like hospitals would be the focus throughout, and now schools have become the focus. I find that interesting. Judith, finish those thoughts off, or disagree?
Completely agree. And it's because it's the human connection. Everyone's talked about it. Whatever our screens offer us, and maybe we were becoming quite addicted to them, so maybe it's a very good corrector for us. I have to say I've seen far fewer phones out and about in school than I did prior to lockdown, because our students are so happy to be back and connecting and speaking and listening. And it's sad that it took this, but the value and power of the human connection with teachers using the tech a bit more effectively, I think it's definitely going to be a positive way forward for everybody.
Well, that's a really interesting observation. Can I just put mine in that I hope this will lead to reform, I don't think under this government, but reform to make a more equal school system, because I think what we've seen over this crisis is just, it's revealed what many people have known all along, that we have an incredibly hierarchical, unequal system where the most affluent children get the most resources, and the opposite is true. And I think people feel angrier about it now and are more aware of it. So I hope that understanding will feed into the actions of some future slightly more thoughtful government, she said very tactfully. I've got one thing to say, which is an appeal from Salisbury World, which is the brilliant refugee centre attached to our local primary school. And they're talking about the digital divide. They knew we were talking about it tonight. And they said, this is really important. It's a veritable, the digital divide is a veritable chasm, says Sarah Reynolds from Salisbury World. We have families sharing mobile phones and completely unable to manage school requirements. This is only going to get worse in the current climate. Salisbury World would like any second-hand working laptops to give to refugee school children. So this is to all of you who are on who are the audience tonight. Please either hand over those laptops to Salisbury World in person at the Food Hub at 22 Lonsdale Road on Mondays between 1 and 3 o'clock, or email on trustees, as in a trustee of an organisation, plural, at Salisbury World, that's one word, and it's Salisbury spelled SALUSBURY world.org.uk to arrange a handover. That's so important. So if anybody does have, and I know people do have second-hand laptops hanging about, please give it to somebody who needs it. And on that note, we're only 1 minute over time, which is amazing. Can I thank all of you for your input? It's been really interesting. As always, we could have gone on for a lot longer. And can I thank you all, and thank everybody who's switched on tonight, or whatever the right phrase is, you'll know, Steve. And with that, say goodbye.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye.
Good night. Good night.